I call Sue Kesley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will not be supporting the motion to disallow the whatever it was, the standard. We were not a part of the Regulations Review Committee, and we do share the concerns that the Labour Party mentioned, that there was a very short one-month consultation. Nevertheless, we think that the government acted wisely when it followed Ireland and the United Kingdom, who put on hold their mandatory folate fortification plans, and the government instead has initiated a 2-year review before moving to mandatory fortification. And we think that this was a very wise decision, and we wholeheartedly support the government in this. And the reason for this is, in our view, if we're going to think about introducing mandatory fortification, compulsory measures that would affect virtually every New Zealander, rather than a voluntary measure which would allow consumer choice, then there would need to be a much higher test. The government would need to be sure that requiring a synthetic additive to be added to almost every loaf of bread in New Zealand would have to be absolutely certain that it would be effective, that nobody would get too high a dose of folic acid, that there would not be any harmful side effects in the long term, and that there is no better way of achieving the desired outcome. And in our view, mandatory fortification of all bread, or virtually all bread with folic acid, would fail all of those criteria, namely it's unlikely to be effective, it would result in some sectors of the population receiving a too high a dose. There is, and I will expand on this, significant scientific concern about the long-term effects of mandatory fortification, and I've done the examination of the scientific research as well as Moana Maki, and there are better ways of achieving the desired outcome. So looking first at its effectiveness, would that be effective? Would adding folic acid to bread achieve its objective of reducing spina bifida in the population? Well, the government's own advice from the New Zealand Food Safety Authority and from the Minister estimates that in order to be effective, women would need to eat approximately 11 slices of bread every day to get the necessary supplementation if they were not eating a diet rich in folate. And the problem is the people that we're targeting are the very people who don't eat a diet rich in folate. And they said, the advice went on to say, it's interesting, the member said she wanted to have a reasoned debate and she understood there are different points of view on this, and yet here she is, shouting about it. I mean, let's just have a reasonable debate because there are very different points of view. The Minister went on to say, as well as consuming up to 11 slices of bread, in fact it was the Food Safety Authority, women would also need to take folic acid supplementation at the same time. And this begs the question, how many young women, particularly the young women we would be targeting, are likely to consume approximately 11 slices of bread every day? Few, if any, I would suggest. But the other question is, why would a government want to encourage anyone, a woman or anyone, to eat 11 slices of bread a day, since this would contribute to obesity rates, consequent health problems such as type 2 diabetes? So why would the government propose a public health measure that would contribute to significant public health problems, especially when it's allegedly committed to reducing obesity and type 2 diabetes? The second issue is, could the government be certain that nobody would get too high a dose of folic acid if there was mandatory fortification? And the answer is they could not, because the government has been given advice by the Food Safety Authority that some children will regularly consume excessive amounts of folic acid if we go ahead with mandatory fortification. They say, to quote them, "We continue to have concerns that 13.8% of males aged 5 to 8, 8.2% of New Zealand females would exceed the upper level intake." And they point out that mandatory fortification in America resulted in 43% of children under 5 years of age having too much folic acid. So we know that our young children would be having too higher doses of folic acid according to the Food Safety Authority. Now, should this matter? Does it matter? Does it matter? So what, many will say? Well, actually, it matters a lot because we have considerable conflicting research about the benefits and harms of folic acid. So sure, there is evidence, we do not dispute it, that folic acid can protect against some cancers and against spina bifida, but at the same time, it can accelerate the risk of developing cancers, in particular colon cancer, and the growth of precancerous tumours and cells, which are, of course, common in our population. In other words, folic acid, high intakes of folic acid, can be beneficial to some and detrimental to others at the same time. And I can recite many professors, if the member would like, but I'll just quote one here, Professor Joel Mason. He says, it's a two-edged sword. We are presented with a horrible dilemma that on the one hand, taking ample quantities of folic in the diet can be helpful. On the other hand, it might be accelerating the risk of developing cancer in some people. So, because of this, Professor David Smith, he says, since a high folic acid intake may be harmful to some people and cause the growth of precancerous tumours and cells, and I want to quote this, quote, nations considering fortification should be cautious. I repeat that. Nations considering fortification should be cautious and should undertake further research before developing strategies for the population as a whole. In fact, he's also quoted as saying, fortifying all flour with folic acid is potentially a national health disaster. And he argues, if the Americans had known in 1996 what we know now, they would never have introduced it. So we can't dispute this. There is evidence that it can cause precancerous tumours to grow, while there is also evidence that it can be beneficial to some. So I would have to ask, why would a responsible government, faced with evidence that high intakes of folic acid can cause precancerous tumours to go, why would it introduce it on a mandatory basis in all bread, so that every New Zealander would be consuming, and some would be consuming potentially dangerously high levels of folic acid? Now, some researchers are worried about epidemiological research that shows that at the same time that Canada and America introduced mandatory fortifications, there has also been an increase in the rates of colon cancer. Now, everyone acknowledges this doesn't prove a link, but it does invite caution, and that's why one of the reasons why both Ireland and the United Kingdom have put mandatory fortification on hold while they look at the emerging issues of cancer risk. These are conservative bodies. And similarly, the Irish, for a group of experts, they said we should defer the decision because they're aware of new studies that suggest a link between high intake of folic acid with risks of cancer. Now, they have also found, Ireland found, that voluntary fortification there increased folate levels in its population by 30%, and said actually there's no need for mandatory fortification if you have a successful rollout of voluntary fortification. I am aware that 34 brands of bread have been fortified with folic acid. And other researchers say if half of all women planning a pregnancy took folic acid supplements at the correct time, the reduction in the incidence of neural tube defects would be equivalent to that achieved by mandatory fortification. But I think we have the bakers. There was concern, would the bakers come through on their promise that they would introduce voluntary fortification of bread? They have introduced it to 34 breads. Frankly, I'm concerned that many of the breads they're doing, there is wholemeal breads. It should be focused on white breads. The member for Labour pointed out that one of the problems is wholemeal bread does have folic acid in it,